The music was perfect. It was the scorching, unmistakable riff of Sweet Home Alabama, the sound of American freedom. The man who co-wrote that anthem, Ed King, 1949 to 2018, was the key to Lynyrd Skynyrd's immortal rhythm. Yet his legacy is not one of triumph, but of a sick, brutal irony. The band he built flew into a swamp, a plane, 6 bodies. That was the devastating price paid for their sound. But Ed King didn't pay it. Why? Because he didn't just quit the band. He deserted them 2 years earlier over a petty argument, choosing his pride over the brotherhood. He walked away, and fate rewarded his cowardice. It let him say, he escaped the wreckage, only to be imprisoned by the sound of his dead friend's music, a relentless, echoing reminder of the day his act of abandonment saved his life. This is not a story of a lucky escape. This is an indictment of the man who was spared, only to be forced to live with the unbearable guilt of the survivor. To understand why Ed King's life is a tragic warning about the cost of being an outsider, we have to go back to where it all began. And it began not in the hot, humid swamps of Florida, but in the sunny, perfectly ordered boulevards of post-war Southern California. Edward Calhoun King was born on September 14, 1949, in Glendale, California. Glendale was more than just a suburb of Los Angeles. It was a symbol of the American dream. In the optimistic atmosphere of post-World War II, it was a world of perceived stability and clear expectations. His father, Edward King Sr., was an Irish civil servant, a government man who believed in rules, order, and respect. His mother, Frances, a homemaker of English descent, provided warmth but also maintained that order in the family. Ed grew up in a middle-class environment where everything seemed to be set, but beneath that placid surface, a quiet tragedy was beginning to shape young Ed's psyche. His father, due to the nature of his government job, was constantly on the move. The King family moved repeatedly from Glendale to other parts of Los Angeles and then back again. For a child, this was more than just an inconvenience, it was an uprooting. Ed was the permanent new kid at school. He was constantly forced to learn how to fit in, only to be pulled away again, just as he began to feel comfortable. He learned never to get too attached, never to depend on one place or one group of friends. He developed a deep sense of rootlessness. This feeling of not really belonging anywhere became a core psychological wound for him, creating an outsider complex and a deep insecurity that his future success could never erase. In this ever-changing world, Ed found his only constant, music. In the 1950s, when Ed was between 5 and 10, KFWB radio was his connection to a much wider world. He pressed his ear to the speaker, listening to a world that was shaking. On one hand, there was the rebellious growl of Elvis Presley, a raw, dangerous energy his parents couldn't understand. On the other, there was the smooth, complex jazz of Miles Davis. And then there was his grandmother. She introduced young Ed to old records by Bessie Smith, the Queen of the Blues. It was a sound from another place, a sound of raw pain, of unadulterated soul. Ed's musical brain was being shaped by these conflicting influences. The rebellion of rock and roll, the complexity of jazz, and the raw soul of the blues. He didn't just listen to music, he dissected it. As he entered his teens, a deep conflict emerged in his own home. Ed yearned for an electric guitar, a symbol of rebellion, the voice of his generation. But his father, Edward Sr., a man of order, intervened. He was strict and perhaps pragmatic. He forced Ed to learn bass guitar. In his father's mind, the electric guitar was rebellious noise. But the bass, it was foundation. It was what kept the band on track. It was proper music. Ed's first conflict over proper music and rebellion began right there in his living room. He reluctantly complied, but his desire for melody, for leading, was pent up. He attended Glendale High School, and like thousands of other teenagers, he joined local garage bands. From 1964 to 1965, he played bass in a group called the 6 Feet Under. But even there, he felt like an outsider. The 1960s in Los Angeles were a period of intense cultural change. Hippie culture was exploding, a world of long hair, freedom, and new thinking. But Ed was caught in the middle. At home, he faced his family's conservative values, where long hair was a sign of disrespect. At school, he found himself not quite fitting in with the real rebels. He later described himself as a Southern California hippie, but that was more a costume he wore to hide his insecurities. He wasn't a natural rebel. He was a serious musician, an analytical mind caught in a world that demanded either conformity or outright rebellion. The feeling of misfit from these early failed garage bands only strengthened his resolve. If he couldn't fit in, he would become so good that no one could ignore him. In 1965, at age 16, Ed King made a decisive move. He formed a band with his friends, Mark Weitz and Lee Freeman. They began playing clubs on Los Angeles' legendary Sunset Strip. They called themselves Strawberry Alarm Clock. The Sunset Strip in the mid-1960s was more than just a street. It was the epicenter of a new music scene. It was where a cultural and musical revolution was happening every night. Clubs like Whiskey A Go-Go were the essential venues, and the leading bands were acts like The Doors, Love, and The Byrds. And now, 16-year-old Ed King was right in the middle of it. Strawberry Alarm Clock were quickly making a mark with their unique psychedelic sound. They signed to Uni Records in 1966. But Ed, ever conscious of his image, was still insecure. He had a little secret, a white lie he often told. He said he joined the band at 14. He was actually 16. Why lie? It was the insecurity of the outsider. He wanted to create a myth of prodigy, a veneer of specialness, perhaps because he feared that his talent, his own, was not enough. There was one aspect of hippie culture, however, that Ed King actively rejected, and it would profoundly shape his destiny. The Sunset Strip was saturated with drugs, which many considered essential for creativity, or a new sensibility that everyone was looking for. But Ed saw its dark side early on. He saw friends, other musicians, drifting, losing control, and some of them overdosing. It scared him. While those around him were expanding their minds with chemicals, Ed remained sober. He had a deep, almost obsessive aversion to substance abuse. The scene presented a stark paradox. He was a hippie who didn't use drugs, playing in a psychedelic band at the epicenter of the drug revolution. Again, he was an outsider. He was an observer, not a participant. He was the sober musician in a room full of users. This sobriety and self-control further separated him, becoming another part of his defense mechanism, but it also separated him from those around him, an aloofness that would be amplified 1,000-fold when he met the boys of Lynyrd Skynyrd. In 1967, Strawberry Alarm Clock captured the spirit of the Summer of Love with an unthinkable anthem, Incense and Peppermints. The song was a massive, unexpected hit, selling millions of copies and rocketing to number one on the Billboard Hot 100 by November 1967. Fueled by this success, the album of the same name also climbed to number 11, catapulting an 18-year-old Ed King to instant rock stardom. The band toured the country, opening for giants like the Beach Boys and Buffalo Springfield. They appeared on American Bandstand and The Ed Sullivan Show. They shaped the sound of psychedelic pop. But even at the height of their success, there were cracks. Ed co-wrote that big hit, but because of the band's corporate structure, he wasn't given full credit. Another scratch on his already sensitive ego. After their initial success, Ed switched from bass to lead guitar in 1968. He wanted to push the band in a harder, more complex rock direction, but the pressure from the industry was immense. Subsequent albums Wake Up, It's Tomorrow, and The World in a Seashell failed to recreate the magic. In 1969, they had another hit cover of Good Morning Starshine. But for Ed, this was a compromise. This was pop, not rock. Internal arguments about musical direction began to erupt, especially between Ed, who wanted the complexity of rock, and Mark Weitz, who leaned toward more accessible pop. And while the band was slowly falling apart, Ed King's pragmatic, rootless nature resurfaced. He began doing something he later admitted to in an interview with Premier Guitar. On tour, he would buy food and resell it to the other band members at a 500% markup. This is an astonishing detail. It wasn't just greedy, it was a survival mechanism. This was the rootless kid who knew everything could fall apart at any moment. He didn't believe in band stability. He didn't believe in brotherhood. He believed in cash in his pocket. How profound was the alienation this must have created? He was the sober hippie who didn't do drugs, and now he was the bro who was profiting off his bandmates. He was isolating himself, building a financial wall around himself just as he built an emotional wall. He was a capitalist in hippie clothes, the perfect outsider. By 1970, the Uni Records contract was gone. Record sales had plummeted. The other members were deep into drug problems. Ed, who had been sober and witnessed it all, had seen enough. In 1971, Strawberry Alarm Clock officially broke up. The psychedelic era for the band was over. For Ed, this was a deeply personal tragedy. He mourned the lost momentum. He felt like he had reached the top only to fall. The specter of this failure, of a band falling apart because of internal conflict and lifestyle, would become a recurring theme. But there was a fateful event that occurred in the dying days of SAC. On a tour of the South in 1968, SAC opened for a little-known local band from Jacksonville, Florida, then called the 1%. It was a cultural contrast that could not have been more stark. Strawberry Alarm Clock, brightly dressed California boys, playing psychedelic, uplifting music. And then the 1% took the stage. They were rough, loud, sweaty, playing brutally honest Southern blues rock. They were a close-knit, dangerous, real band of brothers. Ed King, the analytical musician, was deeply impressed. He paid special attention to their lead singer, a small but charismatic young man with the looks of a street fighter and the soul of a poet. His name was Ronnie Van Zant. 3 years later, in 1971, with Ed's California dream shattered, he did something no one expected. He, the Southern California hippie, fled Los Angeles. He fled the pretense, the memories of failure, the drug scene he loathed. He moved south. He fled to Florida and Alabama, where he worked as an obscure studio musician, trying to find his footing. He was running from his past, unaware that he was heading directly toward his next, more consequential, musical chapter. He was running toward Ronnie Van Zant. When Ed King left Los Angeles in 1971, he wasn't just running from a broken band, he was running from a dead dream. The summer of love dream had turned into a nightmare of addiction, failed gigs, and empty promises. At 22, Ed King was a former rock star, a man who had been on top with a #1 hit nationwide, and now he was back to square one. He, a Southern California hippie, had moved south. He traveled to Florida and Alabama, working as an obscure studio musician, playing whatever gigs he could find just to pay the bills. It was a silent humiliation. He was a sober observer at a party that had gone bad, and now he was cleaning up the mess. Little did he know, his brief encounter 3 years earlier with a local band called the 1% and their charismatic frontman, Ronnie Van Zant, was no accident. It was a seed planted. And in 1972, while Ed was struggling with his own lackluster career, that seed began to sprout. His opportunity came in the form of a phone call. On the other end of the line was Ronnie Van Zant. His band, now renamed Lynyrd Skynyrd, was in trouble. Their original bassist, Leon Wilkeson, had just left abruptly, just before they were to begin recording their debut album with legendary producer Al Kooper. Ronnie was in desperate straits, and he remembered Ed King. He remembered the California hippie who had impressed him so many years ago. Ronnie didn't care where Ed came from. He cared about talent. He heard in Ed a professionalism, a melodic flair that his band, Rough and Tumble, lacked. Ronnie made him an offer. Come to Jacksonville. Be our bassist. For Ed, this was more than a job. It was a crucial second chance, and he immediately agreed. He packed his things, got in his car, and drove to Jacksonville, Florida, straight into the heart of a world he was utterly unprepared to face. If Los Angeles was a hallucinatory dream, Jacksonville was a stark, grounded reality. It was an industrial city, a port city, a place of dive bars, brawls, and a kind of uncompromising Southern pride. And Lynyrd Skynyrd was the embodiment of that city. When Ed King walked into Lynyrd Skynyrd's practice room, the contrast couldn't have been more stark. Ed, who had played on the Sunset Strip, was a disciplined studio musician. He was business-minded, he was sober, and he saw music as a craft. Then he met the band. They weren't just a band, they were a brotherhood. They were a tribe. Gary Rossington, Alan Collins, Bob Burns, Billy Powell, and their undisputed leader, Ronnie Van Zant. They had grown up together, fought together, and lived and died for each other. They were bound by Southern loyalty, by bottles of Jack Daniels, and by a ruthless ambition to be the greatest band in the world. And in came Ed King, a Yankee, a California hippie, a guy who didn't drink much, a guy who didn't like to fight, a soft-spoken guy. From the very beginning, he was the outsider. They called him the California guy. They teased him about the way he dressed, the way he talked. To them, he was an oddity. But Ed suppressed his insecurities. He brought his bass and his professionalism. He was a hired professional joining a deeply bonded insular group. And then, just as Ed was beginning to settle in, fate played a cruel joke on him again. Leon Wilkeson, the original bassist, who had suffered a crisis of confidence, decided to return. For a moment, it looked like Ed King was being pushed off the edge again. His opportunity seemed to be disappearing. He was being replaced. But then, in a moment of pure genius, Ronnie Van Zant looked at Ed and made a decision that would change rock history. Ronnie said, "Don't worry, Leon is back on bass. You," he pointed at Ed, "you're not a bass player. You're a guitarist. Take the guitar." And just like that, the legendary three-guitar army was born. It wasn't a deliberate plan. It was a happy accident. And it created a unique sound. You had Gary Rossington with his bluesy, dirty, soulful slide guitar. You had Alan Collins, a lightning-fast, furious, precise riff machine. And then you had Ed King. Ed didn't play like them. He was a California guy. He brought influences from jazz, from psychedelic, from West Coast rock. His sound was clean. It was melodic. It didn't growl, it soared. While Rossington and Collins provided the raw, bluesy Southern foundation, Ed King added the clean, melodic leads and complex harmonies. He was a composer in a band of brawlers, and that contrast was highly effective. They went into the studio with producer Al Kooper to record their debut album. And it was in the structured environment of the studio that Ed King shined. While the other members could be wild and unpredictable, Ed was a professional. He showed up on time. He was prepared. He was the guy Al Cooper could count on to get the job done. In August 1973, the world heard the results. The album, pronounced Lynyrd Skynyrd. It was a manifesto, a perfect blend of Southern roughness and studio sophistication. And within it, there was the immortal anthem Freebird. Although the famous opening piano riff belongs to Billy Powell, it was the dense layers of guitar, woven by the three, especially Ed's melodic solos, that helped build the song to its explosive climax. The album was a success. The band began to tour relentlessly, and Ed King, the outsider, was now an integral part of the machine. But it was in the spare time between rehearsals that an event occurred that would define Ed King's legacy forever. The story has become legendary. It was 1974. The band was preparing for their second album, Second Helping. One night, Ed King woke from a dream, a simple, catchy riff playing over and over in his head. Or maybe it was just a riff he was idly playing while waiting for the others. Legends often have multiple versions. The reality is, Ed started playing that riff. 4 simple, repetitive notes with a country rock feel. Ronnie Van Zant, who was sitting in the corner of the room, immediately looked up. His eyes lit up. Ronnie was an instinctive genius. He recognized a hit immediately. He asked Ed to play it again, then again. In less than an hour, they had the skeleton of a song. Ed King, with his structural mind, wrote 3 separate sections: the main riff, the chorus, and the bridge. Ronnie, inspired by those riffs, went home and wrote the lyrics that night. The lyrics Ronnie wrote were more than just lyrics. They were a potent political and cultural statement. At that time, musician Neil Young had released 2 songs, Southern Man and Alabama. Both were powerful critiques of the South's history of racism and conservatism. For many, it was a necessary criticism. But for Ronnie Van Zant, a man who was proud of his Southern heritage to the core, it was an insult. He felt Neil Young was using too broad a brush to smear all Southerners. And Ronnie fought back. The song Ed King and Ronnie Van Zant wrote that night was called Sweet Home, Alabama. This is the height of the irony in Ed King's life. He, a California hippie, a freethinker, with no political bias, co-wrote the greatest and most controversial anthem of Southern pride. Ed didn't care about politics. He cared about music. He had created the perfect riff. Ronnie, the poet of defiance, turned it into a manifesto. The song was an instant hit. It climbed to number 8 on the Billboard charts, became a gold single, and propelled the album's Second Helping to number 12. Lynyrd Skynyrd were no longer a Southern band. They were global superstars. And Ed King was the writer of the riff the world knew. They continued their success with the album Nothin' Fancy in 1975, which peaked at number 9. Ed co-wrote another hit, Saturday Night Special, a song that was actually anti-gun. Again, a stance that seemed at odds with the band's image, but perfectly suited Ed King, the moderate outsider. On the surface, Ed King had it all. He was a member of the biggest rock band in America. He was a respected musician. He was making a lot of money. But beneath the surface, the brotherhood was rotting, and Ed's inherent difference was making him a target. Success meant relentless touring. In 1975, they embarked on what the members would later call the Torture Tour. The name was no joke. It was a relentless, soul-crushing schedule of nearly 100 shows packed into just a few months. The fatigue was unimaginable. The pressure was inhuman. And the already unstable Lynyrd Skynyrd machine began to crumble. And this is where Ed King's outsider status became a dangerous liability. His very nature, disciplined, professional, and sober, was a constant affront to the band's chaotic, alcohol-fueled brotherhood. He wasn't one of them. And Ronnie Van Zant, a leader who believed conflict bred greatness, knew it. Ed's professionalism wasn't seen as an asset. It was seen as arrogance. His sobriety wasn't respected. It was viewed as judgment. This fundamental disconnect, the tension between the California hippie and the Southern tribe, confirmed all their suspicions. Ed King was a mercenary, a hired gun, not family. Resentment grew, and the one stirring it was their leader. Ronnie Van Zant, who might be a genius poet, was also a tyrant. He believed that conflict made for great music. He believed that to keep his band sharp, he had to keep them on the brink of violence. He was a heavy drinker, and when he drank, he became intimidating. He would pick fights with his own bandmates, brutal fights to assert dominance. And he started targeting Ed King. Ed was the perfect target. He was the outsider. He was physically weak compared to the others. He didn't fight back. He hated violence. He was the California hippie Ronnie could use as an example. Ed King was living in a living hell. Remember, this was a man who had left his first band in part because he was disgusted by the drug lifestyle. Now he was locked on a tour bus with a group of violent alcoholics who saw him as their punching bag. He was scared. This wasn't about music anymore. This was about survival. In an interview years later, Ed admitted that fear of physical violence from his own band was the real reason he left. He didn't regret leaving. He regretted staying too long. He hid this fear of being seen as weak, but it was eating him up inside. The torture tour continued, and the tension reached a boiling point. It happened at a show in Ann Arbor, Michigan, in mid-1975. Mid-show, a string on Ed's guitar snapped. It was a normal technical problem. It happened all the time. But to a drunk, tired, and angry Ronnie Van Zant, it wasn't an accident. It was a sign of unprofessionalism. It was a personal affront to him. Ronnie, right there on stage in front of thousands of fans, started attacking Ed. He was yelling, insulting Ed on a technical level. After the show in the dressing room, the confrontation escalated. Ronnie lunged at Ed. Witnesses say it was an uncontrollable rage. Ronnie yelled at Ed, blamed him for everything, called him a California loser. Threats of violence were made. There were rumors of a punch being thrown, or at least an attempt to. For Ed King, that was the last straw. This wasn't Strawberry Alarm Clock. This wasn't an argument about musical direction. This was a drunk man, stronger than him, threatening his life, the rootless kid, the one who had learned to fend for himself, the one who had built emotional and financial walls around himself, the one who had always been the outsider. His defense mechanism kicked in. He didn't yell back. He didn't fight back. He did what he always did when the world got too chaotic. He retreated. That night, Ed King quietly returned to his hotel. He didn't say a word to anyone. He didn't issue an ultimatum. He didn't negotiate. He, the man who wrote Sweet Home Alabama, the man who was at the top of the rock world, calmly packed his bags, and in the middle of the night, he left the hotel, took a taxi to the airport, and flew home. In 1976, for the first time in 3 years, Ed King could breathe. The storm he had lived inside, the chaotic, violent, brilliant hurricane that was Lynyrd Skynyrd, was now a distant roar on the horizon. He had left the biggest rock band in the world at the top of its game without a word of goodbye. He had escaped. He had chosen safety over fame, sanity over chaos. He had returned to the orderly, anonymous world of Nashville's Music Row, hoping to disappear into the work of a studio musician. He had traded the roar of 20,000 fans for safety. He was safe, he was sane, but he had also become invisible. He was now just a footnote, that guy who used to be in Lynyrd Skynyrd. What Ed King didn't know was that an argument over a broken string and a drunken rage had saved his life. He didn't realize that his decision to flee, an act of self-preservation he might have considered cowardly, was actually an intervention of fate. He had stepped off the stage and out of the spotlight just before the sky fell. The sound of engines dying, the sound of metal tearing through trees. It was the sound of fate, a sound Ed King would never hear himself, but it would forever echo in his mind for the rest of his life. What did he discover when he learned that his cowardly act was an act of fate? He hid. He retreated. He tried to become invisible. He thought he had escaped the storm, but he didn't know that the ghosts of the band he had left and the one who had replaced him were about to bind him to their legacy forever. He was safe, but he could not escape. This storm had only just begun. He was the man who had written Sweet Home Alabama, and then, quite literally, walked away from it all. To the music world, it was an act of career suicide, an incomprehensible betrayal of the rock and roll dream. To his former bandmates, he was a deserter, the California hippie who couldn't handle the heat. But to Ed King, he was the only sane man in the asylum. He was alive. He wasn't getting into drunken brawls. He wasn't living in fear of his own band's volatile, charismatic, and terrifying leader. He had saved himself. The kid who had fled the rigid order of his father's house and then fled the psychedelic chaos of Los Angeles had now fled the tribal violence of the South. He was, once again, the outsider, alone but safe. He moved to Nashville, the antithesis of the Skynyrd scene. This was a city of professionals, of songwriters who treated music like a 9-to-5 job. It suited him. It was a return to the structured, proper music world he had always understood. He was a craftsman, not a brawler. He played on other people's records, his clean, melodic guitar licks, adding a touch of class to faceless country and pop songs. It was a low-profile existence. He tried to start his own bands, but they fizzled out. He formed a group called Sub-Zero Degree, a name that perhaps reflected his new, cooled-off existence. It flopped. The magic, it seemed, had stayed with Skynyrd. And as Ed King's star faded into relative obscurity, the one he had left behind was exploding. Lynyrd Skynyrd didn't just replace Ed King. They found someone who, in many ways, was his perfect mirror. His name was Steve Gaines. Gaines was a guitar prodigy, a songwriter, and a singer. He brought a fresh, explosive energy to the band, a fire that even Ronnie Van Zant admitted was pushing him to be better. In 1977, they released the album Street Survivors. It was their masterpiece, a stunningly mature, powerful, and diverse record. It was the sound of a band at the absolute peak of its creative powers. The album cover famously depicted the band engulfed in flames, a prophetic, horrifying image, and the centerpiece of that new sound was Steve Gaines. From his quiet life in Nashville, Ed King had to watch. He had to listen to the radio and hear the songs that should have been his. He had to see the magazine covers featuring the man who had taken his job, his place in the three-guitar army. It was a complex, bitter cocktail of emotions, almost impossible to fully comprehend. There was relief, yes, but there must have been regret, a deep, agonizing pang of what if. What if he had just been tougher? What if he had just held on? He was 28 years old and he was already a has-been, haunted by the success of the band he had abandoned. He was safe, he was sane, but he was irrelevant. And then on October 20th, 1977, the universe, in an act of staggering, cruel irony, made his decision to leave the most important decision of his life. The news would have trickled in slowly, then all at once. A phone call, a frantic report on the evening news. A chartered Convair CV-240 flying the band from Greenville, South Carolina to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, had run out of fuel. It had crashed nose first into a swampy forest in Mississippi. The initial reports were chaotic, but soon the devastating, incomprehensible truth emerged. Ronnie Van Zant was dead. Steve Gaines was dead. His sister, backup singer Cassie Gaines, was dead. Assistant road manager Dean Kilpatrick was dead. Both pilots were dead. The rest of the band, Gary Rossington, Alan Collins, Billy Powell, Leon Wilkson, Artemis Pyle, were alive but horrifically injured. Smashed, broken, and traumatized, but alive. The storm that Ed King had fled, the hurricane of violence, booze, and chaotic energy, had finally, literally, crashed into the earth. We must stop here and try to comprehend what this moment must have been like for Ed King. This is not the story of the men who were on the plane. This is not the story of Billy Powell, who survived the impact, his nose nearly torn from his face. This is not the story of Artemis Pyle, who with broken ribs crawled from the wreckage to get help. Theirs is a trauma of fire, metal, and impact. Ed King's trauma was one of silence, distance, and a chilling realization. His first feeling was likely shock, then profound human grief. These were his brothers. He had eaten with them, fought with them, made immortal music with them. He had fled Ronnie Van Zant's violence, but he had also loved his poetic genius. He was gone. But after the grief came the cold, sharp, terrifying realization. That should have been me. He wasn't on that plane for one reason, and one reason only: a broken guitar string and a fist fight 2 years earlier. His cowardice, his weakness, his refusal to endure the violence had saved his life. The very thing he may have felt ashamed of was the one thing that kept him alive. This was the foundation of Ed King's true, lifelong psychological burden: survivor's guilt. But Ed's guilt was a special, insidious kind. It was the guilt of the escapee. The men who survived the crash were heroes marked by their shared ordeal. Ed was the man who wasn't there. He was the soldier who left the battlefield just before the final fatal battle. He was separate. He was, once again, the outsider. He was alive, but he would never be free. The memory of his dead friends had just become a permanent part of his life. And then, in the midst of this psychological torment, Ed King discovered a detail, a piece of information so bizarre, so chillingly symmetrical, that it would have shattered any sense of random chance. It was a secret he would carry for years, a piece of dark magic that, in his mind, confirmed he was part of a story written by a cruel and knowing God. Steve Gaines, the man who had replaced him, the man who died in the seat that should have been his, shared the exact same birthday as Ed King, September 14th. This was not just a coincidence. It was a chilling, almost unbelievable fact. Try to put yourself in his position upon discovering that fact. The effort to simply comprehend that fact was almost too much. The man who took your job, who played your guitar parts, who died in your place, was your cosmic twin, born on the exact same day. For a logical, business-minded man like Ed King, this was impossible. It broke his brain. It forced him to believe in something he couldn't see. He called it fate. In an interview years later, he would say, "I always knew I wasn't supposed to be in that band. Steve Gaines and I were born on the same day. I think fate intervened." This fate theory became his shield. It was the only way he could live with the guilt. It wasn't his choice to leave. It was destiny that pulled him away. He was spared. But being spared is its own kind of damnation. While the other survivors, Gary, Alan, Billy, Leon, had each other, united by the shared trauma of the crash, Ed was on an island, alone with his ghosts and his terrifying fate theory. According to the 2001 biography, Whiskey Bottles and Brand New Cars, his guilt manifested in ways he kept hidden for years. He was afraid people would think he was crazy. He began to experience hallucinations. He wasn't just haunted by the idea of the crash, he was haunted by it. He would see Ronnie Van Zant in the room. He would hear the sounds of the crash he wasn't in, the internal noise that he had tried to escape all his life, the noise of his father's disapproval, the noise of Sunset Strip chaos, the noise of Ronnie's drunken rages, had now been replaced by a new permanent internal noise, the sound of a Convair CV-240 tearing through trees, a sound he had never actually heard. The late 1970s and early 1980s were Ed King's wilderness years. His life was now defined in relation to a tragedy he had avoided. He was the man who escaped the Skynyrd crash. He tried to move forward. He was alive, after all. He was in Nashville. He was a musician. How could it? How can you write a simple pop song when your head is full of ghosts and cosmic horror? And then, the past called him back quite literally. In 1980, the survivors of the crash decided to do the only thing they knew how to do, make music. They couldn't call it Lynyrd Skynyrd, not without Ronnie. So they called it the Rossington Collins Band. It was a defiant act of healing, a way to reclaim their lives from the wreckage. And in one of the strangest reunions in rock history, they called Ed King. The atmosphere when he walked into that studio must have been electric with tension. There they are, the men who went through hell, the men who carry the physical scars of the crash. And here is Ed, the man who walked away, the man with no scars, on the outside. What was said? What could be said? The air in that room must have been thick with unspoken words, with shared grief, but from two vastly different planets. Ed King, the eternal outsider, was now the ghost at their feast of survivors. He played session guitar on their debut album, Anytime, Anyplace, Anywhere. He helped them heal, his clean melodic guitar acting as a soothing balm on their raw, wounded sound. He was, once again, the consummate professional, the stabilizer. He was bridging the gap between the living and the dead. But it was only temporary. He was still not one of them. He contributed, but he didn't join. He couldn't. He was a visitor from a different reality. The Rossington Collins Band had some success, but the shadow of Skynyrd, the shadow of Ronnie Van Zant, was too large, and the Skynyrd curse, as some called it, was not finished. Alan Collins, the fiery guitarist, was in a car crash in 1986 that paralyzed him from the waist down. Ed King watched all of this from his safe distance in Nashville. He saw the survivors struggle. He saw them fall. His decision in 1975 to flee the violence looked less and less like cowardice, and more like a chilling act of prophecy. He was free, he was safe, he was alive, but he was completely and utterly trapped. His life was frozen in 1977. He was a man in his 30s living as a relic. His identity chained to a band he had been in for only 3 years. He was waiting. He didn't know for what. He was waiting for the past to finally be finished with him. But the past was not finished. As the 10-year anniversary of the crash approached, in 1987, the world began to stir. The legend of Lynyrd Skynyrd, far from fading, had only grown. A new generation was discovering Freebird and Sweet Home Alabama. The fans wanted more. A phone call came again. This time the proposition was bigger, more dangerous, more impossible. They wanted to do a tribute tour. They wanted to bring Lynyrd Skynyrd back from the dead, and they needed him. They needed the 3-guitar army. They needed the man who had written Sweet Home Alabama. They needed the man who had escaped. Ed King was now faced with the ultimate choice. Could he, the man who had fled the storm, willingly walk back into its shadow? Could he, the man haunted by the ghosts of his dead friends, stand on a stage and play their music? Could the eternal outsider finally, truly, come home? For 10 years, Ed King had lived in the quiet psychological prison of his own survival. He was the man who got away, haunted by the ghosts of Ronnie and Steve and the impossible secret of their shared birthday. He had tried to build a new, quiet life in Nashville, defined by its safety. But the past is a hungry ghost. The legend of Lynyrd Skynyrd was too powerful to stay buried. The call for the tribute tour was not just an invitation, it was a summons. It was the past in the form of Gary Rossington and the other scarred survivors, reaching out from the wreckage and demanding an answer. The choice was never really a choice. How can a ghost refuse a seance? In 1987, Ed King, at 38 years old, said yes. He agreed to rejoin Lynyrd Skynyrd for the tribute tour. On the surface, it was a chance to honor his fallen friends and give the fans who had mourned for a decade one last chance to say goodbye. As the business-minded Ed King surely knew, it was also a guaranteed paycheck, a way to reclaim the fame he had walked away from. But beneath it all, this was a desperate grasp for redemption. It was the eternal outsider's one chance to finally be let back in, a chance to prove, perhaps mostly to himself, that he was not a deserter. He was hoping that by confronting the ghosts, he could finally make peace with them. The first rehearsal must have been one of the most surreal and emotionally charged moments in rock history. What a pressure cooker that room must have been. There was Gary Rossington, his body still aching from the crash. There was Billy Powell, his face reconstructed but his piano-playing hands still moving with that old gospel magic. There was Leon Wilkeson, the Mad Hatter bassist, who had notoriously cheated death himself, and Artemis Pyle, the drummer who had crawled from the wreckage. These were the scarred survivors. Then there was Alan Collins. The fiery guitarist whose duels with Rossington had defined the band's sound was there, but in a wheelchair. A 1986 car accident, fueled by alcohol, had left him paralyzed from the waist down. He was the band's tragic mascot, a living, breathing reminder of the Skynyrd curse. He couldn't play, but his presence was a heavy, sorrowful shadow over the proceedings. And into this room walks Ed King, the escapee, the man with no physical scars, the ghost. And then there was the new guy, a 29-year-old kid with a familiar face and an impossible crushing burden. His name was Johnny Van Zant. He was Ronnie's younger brother, and he was being asked to sing in his brother's place, to fill the boots of a giant. What was that first chord like? When Ed King and Gary Rossington, 2/3 of the three-guitar army, played together for the first time in 12 years? When Johnny Van Zant, summoning all his courage, first sang the words, "If I leave here tomorrow," it was more than a rehearsal. It was an exorcism. It was a resurrection. And for a moment, it must have felt like healing. What was intended as a limited 6-week tribute tour exploded. The public response was overwhelming. It wasn't just old fans. It was a new generation that had grown up on the legend of Skynyrd. The shows sold out instantly. The hunger to hear those songs played by the men who had bled for them was immense. The 1988 live album, Southern by the Grace of God, was a hit. The 6-week tour became a full-blown permanent reunion. Lynyrd Skynyrd was back, and Ed King was a superstar again. This time, his role was even more critical. With Alan Collins sidelined, Ed's clean melodic guitar was no longer just the third guitar. It was a foundational pillar of the new sound, dueling directly with Gary Rossington. And his personality, the quiet, business-minded, professional hippie, was the glue that this fragile new entity needed. While the old guard still had their demons, Ed was the stabilizer. He was the one who showed up on time, the one who could talk to the accountants, the one who could arrange the complex live sets. He was, in effect, the band's musical director, a role he relished. He had found his place, or so it seemed. The tribute tour era, which lasted from 1987 to 1996, was a period of incredible success. They toured the world, playing to massive, adoring crowds in Europe and Asia. Sweet Home Alabama was now a global anthem. Ed King, the man who had been a has-been at 28, was a legend at 40. But as the tribute tour became a permanent job, the old familiar cracks began to appear. A seance is meant to be temporary. When you try to make it your full-time life, the ghosts get angry. The band was no longer a brotherhood. It was a corporation. And corporations fight about one thing: money. The old tensions, which had been buried under a decade of grief, resurfaced. There were arguments over royalty splits. There were power struggles over who owned the legacy. And Ed King, the stabilizer, the business mind, found himself right in the middle of it. And Ed, in a tragic, self-fulfilling prophecy, reverted to his old rootless survival mechanism, focusing on the business, not the brotherhood. The band was no longer a brotherhood. It was a corporation. And corporations fight about one thing: money. When Ed, the pragmatist, argued for a more professional approach or for different royalty splits, it wasn't seen as a business negotiation. It was seen as a betrayal. It was the California hippie again, the mercenary, trying to profit from their tragedy. This confirmed in his own mind and theirs that he was not one of them. He was the eternal outsider, and the old paranoia he had fled in 1975 was back. He would later say, in a moment of bitter honesty, that he regretted rejoining. He said he was just as afraid of the new band's potential for violence and chaos as he had been of the old one. He had, in effect, walked back into the very prison he had escaped. This internal psychological war, the guilt of the survivor, the paranoia of the outsider, the stress of the business, the exhaustion of the road, the nightly burden of playing a tribute to his dead friends. It was a weight that no human soul could carry indefinitely. His body, which had been spared the trauma of the crash, began to revolt. The stress was no longer just mental. It became physical. In 1995, while on tour, Ed King began to feel unwell. He was short of breath, exhausted. This wasn't the normal road fatigue. This was something deep, something broken. He was diagnosed with congestive heart failure. The irony is so profound, it's almost poetic. His heart was bringing. The organ of blood and emotion, the symbolic center of his guilt and his fear, was literally giving out. The stress of living with Ronnie Van Zant's ghost was killing him, just as surely as Ronnie's drunken rages had threatened to. He was put on a waiting list for a heart transplant. His doctors gave him a stark warning: get off the road or die. The choice, which had been so psychologically complex in 1975, was now brutally simple. In 1996, Ed King quit Lynyrd Skynyrd. Again. This was not the frantic middle-of-the-night escape of a terrified young man. This was the slow, weary retreat of a middle-aged survivor. He had fled Ronnie Van Zant's fist in 1975. He was fleeing Ronnie Van Zant's ghost in 1996. He had escaped the storm twice. He returned to his quiet home in Nashville. The roar of the crowd was replaced once again by the quiet hum of a hospital waiting room. He was 47 years old, and his life, which had been a whirlwind of psychedelic highs, southern rock superstardom, profound guilt, and a triumphant resurrection, was now hanging by a thread. He was alone, waiting for a stranger's heart to give him a second chance at a life he had never, ever been at peace with. The man who had escaped the plane crash was now grounded, fighting a new battle, not against a chaotic band, but against his own broken body. The final quiet act of his tragedy was about to begin. The years from 1997 into the new millennium were Ed King's quiet epilogue. This was the long, slow exhale after a lifetime lived holding his breath. He had once again stepped away from the storm, but this time there was no regret, no what if. There was only the quiet daily reality of survival. He was 48 years old, living in his Nashville home, his life now governed not by tour schedules, but by doctor's appointments and waiting. He was, in every sense, grounded. The rock and roll world, as it always does, moved on. The reunited Lynyrd Skynyrd, the machine he had helped restart, simply hired another guitarist and continued the endless tour, the nightly seance. Ed King, for the third time in his life, was on the outside looking in, but this time he seemed to be at peace with it. He was no longer the hippie in the lion's den. He was just a man trying to stay alive. In 2006, a strange and bittersweet moment of public validation arrived. Lynyrd Skynyrd, the classic lineup, the pre-crash brotherhood, was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. That night carried a profound, awkward, and deeply tragic power. There they were, the survivors, gathered to accept an award for an entity that had been destroyed 3 decades earlier. Ed King stood on that stage, a living ghost among ghosts. He was being honored for the 3 explosive, brilliant, terrible years of chaos he had spent a lifetime trying to escape. In his brief speech, he was polite. He thanked the fans, but he stood apart, a visitor at his own coronation. He was absent from many of the other major events, a sign that the old wounds, the old status as outsider, had never truly healed. The Hall of Fame was just a plaque on the wall of a haunted house he had long since moved out of. His true focus was his health. And then, in 2011, a miracle. After years on the transplant list, Ed King received a new heart. He was, quite literally, given a new life, a second chance gifted to him by a stranger. For a man whose entire existence had been defined by a fate that spared him, this was the ultimate confirmation. He had been spared yet again. He spent his final years in a state of quiet contemplation. He was free from the band, free from the road. He would occasionally do session work in Nashville, but his days as a rock star were over. He lived in his Nashville home, a private man, a survivor. He even made a fun, bizarre cameo appearance on the reality TV show Moonshiners in 2017, using his Sweet Home Alabama credibility to buy some illicit gin. It was a moment of levity, a glimpse of the peaceful, quirky man who had been hiding inside the hippie outsider all along. But the body is a fragile thing, and the new heart could not protect him from a new enemy. In 2017, Ed King was diagnosed with lung cancer. This was the one battle he could not flee. This was not a drunken bandmate or a failing organ. This was an invasion. He fought it, as he had fought all his battles, with a quiet, stubborn dignity. But the fight was too much. On August 22, 2018, Ed King died at his home in Nashville. He was 68 years old. There was no violence. There was no plane crash. There was no dramatic rock and roll exit. It was a quiet, isolated death, mirroring the outsider life he had always lived. The news of his passing was respectful, but it was overshadowed by the looming tragic legend of the band he had been in for only 3 years of his long career. Gary Rossington, his fellow guitarist, his rival, and his brother-in-arms, released a statement calling him his brother and a great songwriter. The tributes confirmed his musical legacy, but they all missed the central tragic point of his life. Ed King's legacy is not just Sweet Home Alabama. That riff, a piece of music so perfect it has become part of the global lexicon, is almost a distraction. His true legacy is far more complex and far more human. Musically, he was the essential counterpoint. He was the California hippie whose classical melodic sensibilities gave the raw southern brawl of Lynyrd Skynyrd its sophistication. He was the order to their chaos. He was the clean, soaring guitar that gave the three-guitar army its wings. He was the secret ingredient, the bridge between psychedelic rock and Southern soul, a contribution that influenced countless rock bands from Metallica to modern country. But his personal story, his human story, is a profound cautionary tale. His life was a series of contradictions. He was the business-minded hippie who sold snacks to his bandmates. He was the peaceful man who co-wrote a defiant, controversial anthem. He was the rootless kid who yearned for a brotherhood, only to find himself an outsider in every family he ever joined. And most of all, he was the man who made the right choice for the wrong reasons. He fled in 1975 not because of a premonition, but because he was terrified of a drunken bully. He fled to save his sanity, to protect himself from violence. And that single human act of self-preservation accidentally saved him from annihilation. He was the man who escaped death, but he could never, ever escape the guilt. He was condemned to live the next 40 years of his life as the man who wasn't there. He was forced to watch his replacement, his cosmic twin born on the same day, die in his seat. He was forced to live with the hallucinations, the fate theory, the crushing weight of a salvation he never asked for and felt he didn't deserve. His entire life, from the constant moves as a child to the final quiet years in Nashville, was a search for a place he could be safe, a place he could finally belong, a sweet home that wasn't Alabama or California, but a place of simple, quiet peace. In the end, we are left with the chilling central question of his life. Is it better to die a hero in the storm, or live a long life forever haunted by the shadow of the wreckage? Ed King's music on countless timeless records gives us the melody. His life, a tragic symphony of survival, gives us the answer. He was the king whose reign was a quiet, lifelong escape, a man who survived the hurricane, only to spend the rest of his days adrift in the silence that followed.